Thank you all for joining us. As most of you probably know, I'm Matt Silverman, the director of the Haberman Institute for Jewish Studies, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to our three-part series exploring Asian Jewish communities with Professor Geraldine Gudefin. So at the Haberman Institute, we found that there is a growing interest in learning about the rich diversity of Jewish communities, both in the US and around the world. And this series promises to be a continuation of this fascinating journey that we've explored over the years as we delve more into the Asian Jewish communities. We extend our gratitude, as we often do, to Andrew R. Ammerman for sponsoring our Spring 2025 lecture series. Actually, I wrote spring in my notes. It is now the fall. So the fall lecture series. Andrew dedicates this semester's learning in loving memory of Josephine and H. Max Ammerman and Stephen C. Ammerman. Sponsoring lectures is a meaningful way to honor or remember a loved one or to mark a significant occasion, such as a yard site, a professional or personal achievement, or a milestone celebration. Your sponsorship donations and contributions at all levels allow us to continue building a Jewish community enriched through quality Jewish lifelong learning. For more information on how to get involved, please visit our website or feel free to email me anytime. Much of our programming doesn't allow me and the speaker to see everyone's faces, so I welcome those who are comfortable to share your screen, or not share your screen, but open your video, and it'd be great to be able to see you all. Unlike other programs, we'll be using the chat feature to send in your questions. As usual, try to keep them concise and incomplete sentences. We'll address them probably in the middle of the lecture, maybe some of them if there are, and then toward the end will be the majority of questions will be discussed at that time. The lecture is being recorded, so if you missed anything or anybody else who registered, it will be available to all of you. And so with that, I want to welcome Geraldine Gudefin. She's a French-born modern Jewish historian specializing in Jewish migration, family life, and legal pluralism. She holds an MA from Yale University and a PhD in history from Brandeis. Her work has been published in American Jewish History and Nashim, a journal of Jewish women's studies and gender issues. She has received fellowships from the Memorial Foundation for Jewish Culture, the Posen Foundation, and the Center for Jewish History. And with that, I now welcome Professor Gudefin to join us and begin her lesson. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Matt, for the very kind introduction. And I really appreciate the opportunity of being back. I think just a few months after my last lecture. So I don't know if some of you attended the lecture on Jewish roots, but if so, it's a pleasure to have you back. And if not, it's a pleasure to meet everyone for the first time. Thank you for joining, and also thank you for those who have their video on, because it's, being on the other end of it, it's so nice to be able to see faces and have sort of a classroom feel. So I am very, very grateful for this. I have to mention that I'm in Singapore. I live in Singapore, so it is 8 a.m. where I am. So if I stumble on words, it's because I'm not fully awake yet. So apologies for that. So I contacted Matt a few months ago with the idea for this series, and I think the impetus for it was this this feeling that we're at a moment, I think in American Jewish society, where there's a desire to be more inclusive of Jewish diversity, and the variety of Jewish stories and journeys. And as you know, the Jewish community in the United States is very predominantly Ashkenazi. So I think it is very understanding that most people see and understand both Jewish culture and Jewish history through the lens of Ashkenazi history. I think that in the past maybe decade, there's been a greater understanding that this is just part of the full Jewish story, and people have grown more interested in Sephardic Jews, Mizrahi Jews, so Jews originating from the Middle East, And this has been a great development. But sometimes that results in kind of drawing a distinction between Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews that obscures the fact that there are also communities that are neither Ashkenazi nor Sephardic or Mizrahi. So that was really kind of the impetus for this lecture, to draw attention to the fact that there have been other communities, and some of these communities I would like to present to you over the course of this three lecture series. So we're going to be focusing, especially for this lecture, largely on India and China. In China, there have been historically multiple communities, but as I will explain in greater details, with the end of the Silk Road, most of the communities that existed outside of the Kaifeng community, which is the one I will talk about, disappeared. So when we talk about the Chinese Jewish community in ancient times, we're really talking about Kaifeng Jews, and I'll show you where it is on the map in a second. So today in China, there are Jewish communities, but they're either descendant of Baghdadi Jews who came in the 18th, 19th century, or expats. Okay, so the community I will talk about today, there are a few people who identify historically with this history, but there's no established or organized like native Chinese Jewish community per se, but that's something we can discuss more at the end of the lecture or later on in this series. And then for India, we'll be talking about two different communities. The Jewish community of Cochin, which was itself exceedingly diverse, and will be something we'll discuss in the lecture, and the Jews of Kerala, who are called the Bnei Israel Jews. But there are other Indian Jewish communities, both historically and today. But those two communities in India will be the main focus of the lecture. And I think there are a few commonalities between those three communities that need to be highlighted at the outset. The first one is that historically they were small communities, which is why I think a lot of people are not necessarily aware of that history. But these small communities have very ancient origins. And what also distinguishes them from other communities, Jewish communities, is that in these two places, in China and India, Jews experience very minimal anti-Semitism, if any. So their history is really not tied to narratives of persecution. And because they were not persecuted, they were able to flourish in a climate that was very tolerant of very difference, but that also encouraged religious syncretism. And so that's what we're going to see today. So in the case of China, we will see how much Confucian culture influenced the Kaifeng Jewish community, sorry. And for India, we will see that Hinduism was very central to shaping very distinctive religious and cultural identities among different Jewish communities. And so when it comes to how Jews in these two places tell their own stories, in their own legend and oral histories, they both in China and India, they emphasize having been welcomed by the local rulers, by the emperor, by the kings. In both China and India, the Jewish communities received gifts from the ruling authorities, and those gifts were displayed in their synagogue. So this story of tolerance is very much part of the DNA of those communities. And then one thing that's interesting, at least for two communities, for the Kaifeng Jews of China and for the Bnei Israel Jews, is that those were communities that became isolated from the rest of the Jewish world for most of their history. So both communities were actually kind of rediscovered by other Jews in much more recent history. And that's also part of our history of the Jewish people, about communities being rediscovered and the ties that we form with them. And so to end the introduction, what I would say is what's really interesting, and we're going to see this in all three lectures within the series, is that we can see through those earlier examples that debates over Jewish identity, debates over inclusion, debates over the boundaries of Jewish identity are not new questions. And we'll see this today with the responsa from the 16th century. And so that's something I want to bring to your attention, because sometimes we flatten the past. We don't take into account discussions that have been unfolding over centuries, over what the Jewish collective is. So I'm very excited that you're embarking on this journey with me. So we'll start talking about origins, where these communities actually came from, and then we'll talk more about the processes of religious acculturations that they underwent and the kind of very distinctive religious identities that they formed. So I'm going to share my screen. Matt, please do let me know if you have any issues with that. Actually, let me make sure I share the sound so that we don't have the issue we had last time. Yes, okay. If anyone has trouble with the PowerPoint, please let me know. Okay, Matt, how is the PowerPoint?
Looks good to me.
Looks good? Okay. So let's start. So first I wanted to give you a kind of a visual map so that you could see where those communities are located. I created this map with the aid of AI for the first time, so I hope the quality is okay. So on the far east of this map, you can see in northern China, the city of Kaifeng, which hosted a Jewish community for over 8 centuries. So it's a community that existed for quite a long time. And then if you go to the left, left side of the map, then you can see the Indian subcontinent. And I've highlighted, so the first red dot on top says Mumbai. So left of Mumbai, where you have that red dot, is the coast of the Konkan. It's the Konkan region, which is situated today in the state of Maharashtra. So it's right south of Bombay, and that's where the B'nai Israel community originated. And then if you go down this coast, you get to the Malabar coast, and you get to the port city of Kochi. And this is the Cochin Jews. So actually, you might be confused about the terminology, and I apologize. Kochi is the modern name. The old name is Cochin, and often I use them interchangeably. So I apologize for the lack of consistency. But just to clarify, Kochi, Cochin, it's the same place, just a more modern name. Okay. So the Jews who came to Kochi first came in Kranganore, which was actually north of Kochi, but it is on the Malabar coast. So you can see here that the two communities in India that I will be talking about were coastal communities. And this has to do with the role of trade in Jewish history. Okay, so I brought some pictures from Indian Jews. So the first, from Kaifeng Jews. The first one were a depiction of Chinese Jews, which were printed in the British press in the 19th century. And the reason we have these depictions is that in the 19th century, there was a second wave of Christian missionaries going to China who became very interested in Jews. So a lot of the sources that we have for the Kaifeng Jews of China date back to the 17th century when the first Jesuit missionaries came into China, and then 19th century sources produced by both Christian missionaries and Jews who became interested in the fate of Chinese Jews, so particularly British Jews and American Jews. So if you look at the American Jewish press in the 19th century, there were campaigns to raise money to help Chinese Jews and bring them back to Judaism. But this is the end of the story, so to speak. So we'll return to that later. And I also brought you those pictures, or more recent pictures taken respectively in 1910 and in 1938 of one of the last descendants of the Kaifeng Jews. And it's actually the same person. So on the left side, you see a man standing with his family. So that was him being photographed in 1910, and then it's the same man photographed in 1938. So how did Jews end up in China? So first of all, I mentioned that this is a small community, so that's particularly true of the Kaifeng Jewish community. According to some estimates, at its peak in the 18th century, there were no more than 2,000 individuals. Okay, so the numbers are exceedingly small, especially compared to, say, Jewish communities in Eastern Europe at the same time. So the earliest tangible proof of a Jewish presence in China comes from a fragment of a Judeo-Persian letter from the 8th century. And this letter and I believe there are actually multiple Judeo-Persian letters, are in the collections of the British Library in London. So scholars have debated when Jews came to China, but most seem to agree that they really settled in China, specifically in Kaifeng, in the 10th century, so during the Song dynasty. And it seems that the emperor of China, so Kaifeng was the capital city at the time, invited Persian Jews, so Jews from Persia who were merchants, because they were known for their knowledge of cloth manufacturing and their ability to print patterns. So they were actually invited by the Chinese emperor to settle and get involved in manufacturing clothes for the emperor. So one thing we have to really acknowledge when we talk about the Chinese and Indian Jewish communities is that persecutions have definitely played an important role in shaping migration throughout Jewish history. But another very potent force has been trade. And so, as far as we can guess, Jews in China and India came largely as a result of global trading routes. And so here you can actually see, so this is the routes that were taken by the Radhanites. So the Radhanites were a vast network of Jewish travelers in the Middle Ages. And what's really interesting is that these Jewish merchants connected the Mediterranean region to China through the Far East. So you can really see this very long journey. And because they were neither Christians nor Muslims, they were actually intermediaries. They were middlemen who were connecting this different regions, right? So we assume, and this is based on those fragments of letters that are originating from traders, that the first Jews who settled in China really came as merchants. And we actually have further evidence of this, which is diaries and letters from Arab merchants in the 9th century, who describe Jewish merchants who were very highly multilingual. They spoke Arabic, they spoke Persian, they spoke Greek. And so you can see that those medieval Jewish merchants were kind of navigating all those different worlds. And typically they exchange a number of goods, predominantly glassware and linens, in exchange for silk and spices from China and India. So this is really how those first Jews came to China. So the first evidence that we have of a synagogue being built in Kaifeng dates back to the early 12th century. But the problem with Kaifeng is that it was on the banks of the Yellow River, and the Yellow River is known for overflooding. So we know that the community synagogue was actually destroyed at least 4 times, and it was rebuilt up until the latest destruction, which happened at a time when the community was very poor, and they never rebuilt the community. So there is no synagogue in Kaifeng, but there's evidence of the Jewish history in a place called Torah Lane that has some remnants, and there are a few stones. But actually, when the synagogue was destroyed, the community sold a lot of the synagogue stones to a nearby mosque, which used them. So a lot of those stones that belong to the synagogue are now part of surrounding mosque. And that's something that's also really interesting about the Jews of Kaifeng, is that Kaifeng was also a place that had a very high number of Chinese Muslim. And so it's also an interesting place for looking at Jewish Muslim relations in history. So during the first centuries of their life in Kaifeng, Jews really retained their Judeo-Persian culture. So their names were Persian, they spoke Judeo-Persian, as we can see from some letters that we have, but also from the Torah scrolls. So the Torah scrolls are in Hebrew, but they do include some Judeo-Persian. And there's also evidence that some scrolls were brought from Iraq, particularly from the city of Basra. So you can really see those ongoing ties between the Middle East and China through those merchants. But progressively, and this is the story I want to tell today, those Kaifeng Jews really deeply acculturated into Chinese culture. And this process really started fully after the abandonment of the Silk Road in the 14th century. So as I mentioned earlier, we know that there were communities of Persian Jews in cities in the vicinity of Kaifeng. But when the Silk Road was like fell into disarray, those communities had no reason to being really. So those merchants either went back to the Middle East or other places, or they moved to Kaifeng, where the mass of the Jewish community was. And so from the 15th century onwards, this community became truly isolated from the rest of the Jewish world. And that does explain also why they developed the practices that they did. So from the Middle Ages onward, they had very minimal contacts with Jews elsewhere. So in the 15th century, they started acquiring Chinese names. So today, if you meet descendants of those Kaifeng Jews, they have names that you would not recognize as Jewish. And this adoption of Chinese names very much furthered their integration into the local Chinese society. And that's interesting because I think that echoes what's going on today, for instance, in American society, where people might have very English names, but they keep Hebrew names for the purpose of family and community. So it was the same with those Chinese Jews. Though they did adopt Chinese name in the 15th century, they also kept some Hebrew names that they used within the community. Okay, so you see that though they were becoming increasingly integrated into the society, they also retained a very distinct sense of Jewish identity. Something that did distinguish them from other communities, though, from other Jewish communities, is that they began to adopt the Chinese patrilineage organization. That is, that the identity became transmitted through the father line, okay, through the paternal line, which of course is problematic now for people who want to reclaim this history and go back to their Jewish roots, because there's no way that they can claim that they're halachically Jewish. So they really started adopting kind of the Chinese Confucian family structure, and also they began to take local ethnically Chinese wives. So that's why on those pictures that you see, this is a community that is ethnically Chinese because they are intermarried with the local population. So I also mentioned that there were a lot of Muslims in the city of Kaifeng. So what's really interesting is that when European visitors went to China in the 19th century, they realized that Jews were not identified as Jews, but they were called Mohammedans, so Muslims, with blue caps. Because Jews and Muslims dress the same, with the difference that Muslims wore white turbans and members of the Jewish community wore blue turbans. But in China, there was kind of a lack of recognition that Jews were separate from Muslims, and that stemmed in part because of deep cultural similarities between the two groups. So, in Chinese food, there's a lot of pork, but neither Jews or Muslims eat pork. Those are two communities that practice polygamy. They practice circumcision. So you can see from an outsider's perspective how those communities could have been somewhat interchangeable. Okay, so that was a small introduction to the Kaifeng Jews. Now I want to move on to the Jews of Cochin, who were on the Malabar coast of southern India, as I showed on the map. So this is a community who has roots in what is now the state of Kerala in southern India, which is a state I have the pleasure to visit, and it's gorgeous. So if you have any reason to go to India, I highly recommend going there. And contrary to the Kaifeng Jewish communities, there are a lot of traces of Jewish life in Kerala that you can visit. There are cemeteries, there are synagogues, exceedingly beautiful synagogues. The Indian government in the past decade has really made efforts to preserve that heritage. So they have been renovated. So there's really, it's a place with very visible traces of Jewish history if you're interested in going. So the Jewish community in Cochin was historically very small. It might have been actually the smallest Jewish ethnic group in the world. So before they migrated in mass to Israel in the 1950s, again, for reasons that have nothing to do with anti-Semitism, by the way, they numbered a little over 2,000 people. Okay, so historically it was just a few thousand people. So where do these Jews came from? So we don't really know, and that's true of both the Cochin Jews and the Bnei Israel Jews of Maharashtra. But there are two stories which are quite plausible. The first one, which is kind of their old tradition, is that they came to the Kochi region after the destruction of the Second Temple, so in the 1st century. But there are also an hypothesis that they might have come much earlier, possibly during the time of King Solomon, because in the Torah, there is mention of a spice trade between ancient Israel and India. So we know that there were contacts, there were exchanges of goods and people, before the first century. Okay, but we don't know the exact date of when they settled. And what's really interesting about kind of the legends surrounding their origins is that a lot of the legends about when they came to India were preserved in Jewish women's song. That actually the tradition of female singing from Cochin still continues today and has been preserved by Cochin Jewish immigrants who have moved to Israel. And the language in which they sang this song is the local language of southern India, which is one of the local languages, which is Malayalam. So Jews in that part of the world spoke the local dialect with some, Hebrew inflection. So they developed a Jewish dialect of the local language. So this community is quite different, both from the Kaifeng Jews and from the Bnei Israel of India, because they maintained very extensive contacts with other parts of the Jewish diaspora. So they were never isolated from the Jewish world, and because of that, they really retained Jewish halacha, Jewish law. And this original community that came in ancient times was also kind of replenished as a result of multiple waves of migration, especially by Iberian Jews, so Sephardic refugees from Spain and Portugal, who came in the 15th and 16th century. And then later on, you had Jews coming from Iraq and Iran. So it's a very diverse community, ethnically and religiously, because those communities, while being aware of each other, also kind of lived apart from each other, at least from a congregational perspective. So I want to show you evidence of this really early presence in southern India. So the first one, and that's, as far as I know, the earliest trace that we have, is those copper plates that are today actually still housed in the Paradesi synagogue of Cochin. So the community still owns those plates, and those copper plates were issued by a local king to what was then the leader of the Jewish community, and it's written in an ancient Tamil script. It dates back to the year 1000, and the plates stated that the king welcomed the Jews and that he gave them a land to build their synagogue. So you can see in this really early trace, very early historic source, kind of the warm welcome that Jews received in the region. Okay, so another very early evidence of this Jewish presence, I think this is the earliest grave known of a Jewish person in India, and it's a grave of a Jewish woman named Sarah, which dates back to the 13th century. And it's in the courtyard of the Chendamangalam synagogue, which is in the vicinity of Kochi. I mean, again, it's hard to exaggerate how extraordinary this heritage is and how well preserved it is. And here you can see the synagogue where we found that grave, with a very distinct both the exterior and interior architecture. Okay, so we'll talk in the lecture about this distinction that emerged in Kochi between white Jews and black Jews, which I'm using in parentheses. But this is a fascinating document from the 16th century, which was published in a Portuguese book, which is an illustration of Malabarese Jews, so Jews from the Malabar coast of India, where you can see that they have quite a dark complexion, and the issue of complexion and ethnic identity actually played a big role in internal Jewish divisions. But I'll get back to that. Okay, so now the third community, as I said, it's another Indian community, but that is very distinct from the Cochin Jews. So those are the Jews who settled further up on the coast of Konkan in Maharashtra, and they had no contact with the Cochin Jews until the 18th century. Okay, so much later. And this was historically, and actually to this day, the largest Jewish community in India. And today, most of them are in Israel. There are about I think the numbers are contested, but something along the lines of 60,000 B'nai Israel Jews in India. And there are a few remaining in Bombay. So I actually volunteered for the American Joint Distribution Committee over 10 years ago, and I worked with this community. So this is the community I'm most familiar with, and I'm happy to answer more specific questions later. But at the time when I was there, there were about 6,000 Jews. And since I volunteered there, many within the young generation have made Aliyah, have moved to Israel. So my sense is that it's very much a dwindling community, but there are still synagogues. There's still, Jews who are very proud of their heritage and are, go to synagogue. So you can definitely still see some Indian Jewish life in Maharashtra. And so originally they were in those local, like in very small villages along the Konkan. And when did they come? Again, this is a question to which we don't have a definitive answer. But within the community, there's a very specific legend, and people today will still tell the story. And again, it's quite plausible. And the story is that their ancestor came in 175 before the Christian era, and that there was a shipwreck, and there was couples, so both men and women, and that 7 couples survived the shipwreck. And this notion of a shipwreck and this miraculous survival of those 7 couples is really central to kind of the mythology. And I'm not saying this to doubt the veracity of the story, but more in terms of highlighting the ways in which they recount their origins. It's very much still part of their traditions today. And so the shipwreck happened south of Bombay. And as a result of the shipwreck, those families settled in those villages. Okay, and it really wasn't until the 18th century that those villagers moved to places such as Bombay and then Maharashtra and Gujarat, etc. But for most of their history, they really led a very simple life in those rural villages of India. And so I mentioned that you still have synagogues in Bombay, but if you go to the villages today, you also see that heritage. There are still Jewish cemeteries, there are synagogues that have been preserved as well. So it's really fascinating to go into kind of rural India and see very tangible traces of this history. So this is a picture of the family of Esther David. Esther David is a writer who's herself B'nai Israel, and she's written a lot of books that deal with that heritage. And this is a photo of her family, who was originally from one of those villages, but settled in Ahmedabad. I'm not exactly sure when, but probably in the 19th century. So you see this move, as with other communities, for instance, shtetl Jews in Eastern Europe, who moved to bigger cities in kind of recent centuries. And so here, actually, I think this photo is so interesting because you can really see both the Indian influences in the saris that the women are wearing, for instance, and the growing impact of British colonialism, especially in the men's dress. Actually, really, there's a mix. So there's some women in saris, and then both kids and the older generation are also dressed in that kind of more Victorian garb. So we're not actually, in this lecture, there's not much time to talk about British imperialism and the impact it had on Asian Jewish communities, but this will be the topic for the next lecture. So stay tuned. Okay, so I found this really interesting. Okay, sorry. Actually, because I'm seeing the videos, would someone be able to read this? So this is a monument in one of the villages, which is called Navgan. And B'nai Israel Jews who migrated to Israel are still very proud of their B'nai Israel origin, of their Indian origin, and they're very involved in preserving the heritage back in India. And so they had a monument built to memorialize their ancestors who survived the shipwreck, and those who didn't. And so the monument, you can see there's a side in English and a side in Hebrew. Would anyone volunteer to read this?
I think.
Oh, you have to unmute them, Matt. You're my volunteer. Why don't you read it?
But I can read. Yeah. Monument memorializing Jews who died in shipwreck. How did you pronounce the Navgaon? Navgaon. Here lie buried the ancestors of the B'nai Israel community of India who were shipwrecked on the shores of Navgaon nearly 2,000 years ago. They have been true citizens of India and have participated in the freedom movement of the country. With the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, they have emigrated in large numbers to the State of Israel, where they are happily settled.
So here it's really interesting because you can see both the gratitude towards India and the sense of being, proud Israeli Jews. And that's very true of Indian Jews. Those two identities are very much melded in their sense of who they are. Okay, but to go back to the earlier story of Bnei Israel Jews, what's really important to convey is that they remained isolated in those villages until the 18th century. Okay, so they didn't have contacts with the rest of the community, of the Jewish community. And again, in very clear contradistinction with the Cochin Jews. And so because of this lack of contact, they retained Jewish traditions, but it wasn't normative Judaism. So to be more specific, they retained some essential holidays. And actually, they didn't have Hebrew names for those holidays, but they had like local names. They kept circumcising their children on the 8th day. They kept kashrut. So, like in terms of like what fish they would eat or what meat, they had a sense of like specific dietary restrictions, and they knew the Shema Israel. So when Jewish communities later on first met them, they realized that this community knew the Shema Israel. But other than this, they didn't have the Torah, they didn't have the Talmud, they didn't have texts with the liturgy, right? So it really they kind of retained the essentials, but they were quite different from other communities. And they didn't have a synagogue. That's also a big difference with other communities. In terms of language, they adopted the local language, very similar to Indian Jews in the Malabar region. So in Maharashtra, the Jews spoke Marathi, and that's true today. If you go to the Bnei Israel community today, people speak English and Marathi and usually kind of use those two languages together. And those Jewish villagers adopted a lot of the surrounding Hindu and Muslim customs, and that really shaped the kind of Judaism that they practiced. I see there's a hand up, so I'm happy to take a very short break to answer whatever questions might have been put in the chat.
At the moment, I don't see any
Okay,
that
so
have
this
come to
might
me
have been
recently. I'm not. It looks like
okay.
Jenny
I
has
see
her
Jenny
hand
has her
raised.
hand up, but it might be a
Uh,
mistake.
I'm
Okay,
not.
I just want to make sure everyone's on track. Okay, so now what I want to talk about. So, this was kind of a broad overview and we've only scratched the surface, but I really want to talk about this notion of acculturation without assimilation. And this is a term that multiple scholars have used to describe both the experience of Chinese Jews and Indian Jews. So let's start first with the Kaifeng Jews. So the Kaifeng Jews became fully Chinese in culture. As I said, they had Chinese names, they spoke Chinese, they looked Chinese ethnically, but they also retained Jewish practices. So some scholars have called this a synthesis of Chinese and Jewish culture. Okay, I'm going to take a break here for Jenny, because now I can physically see your hand.
Yeah, I was just sorry to say that the chat has been disabled. I did have a question, but I couldn't enter it in the chat because the chat has been disabled. My question was, I'm sorry if I didn't catch it. What led to the opening up in the 1800s? You said the B'nai were isolated until the 1800s. What changed?
So they moved to the cities, right? Because at that point, the British were quite entrenched in India. And so they were developing cities like Bombay. And so those were places of economic opportunity. So you have this beginning of a trend of Jewish villagers moving into the big cities. And there were other Jewish communities in the big cities because some Cochin Jews were already living there. There were already Baghdadi Jews of Iraqi descent. And so these communities actually came into contact. There's also, and this is not a very well-known history, but there's also a sense that Bnei Israel Jews actually underwent kind of a first religious revival in the 16th century by meeting a Jewish merchant who was involved in the Dutch East Asia Company, who was named David Rachabi. So apparently he was the first one to meet the Bnei Israel community and identify them as Jews. So there was an earlier history, but I would say really the trend towards rejoining normative Judaism really started in the 18th century and then very much in the 19th century. So in the 19th century, you have Christian missionaries in India becoming very interested in this community and teaching them the Torah. I mean, but from their perspective of the New Testament, like the Old Testament, not what we call the Torah, but kind of introducing them to the ancient Hebrew text and teaching them Hebrew. So actually in the 19th century, the Bnei Israel community learned Hebrew and became first aware of the Torah through the work of those Christian missionaries, whose goal, of course, was to proselytize, to turn them into Christians. But that didn't work. And what's really fascinating is that the Bnei Israel used this newfound knowledge of the Torah and Hebrew to further their inclusion within Jewish society as opposed to becoming Christians. And then at the same time, in the same century, you have Cochin Jews. So the other Jewish community I spoke about was very learned, right? They never severed their ties to the Jewish community. So Cochin Jews became teachers for the Bnei Israel community, teaching them the liturgy, also being involved in teaching them Hebrew. So through the kind of joint work of Christian missionaries and Cochin Jews, the Bnei Israel Jews became, what we understand as like Jews today, like part of like a normative Jewish culture.
Thank you.
Alan, I see you raised your hand. You're still muted. Sorry, Alan, you're still muted.
I've clicked the button that he can unmute. I'm not sure what you all are
Okay,
seeing.
can you hear me now?
Yes,
Yes.
I'm sorry.
Going back to the Kofrin Jews, did the
Yes.
Judeo-Chinese language develop or anything like that? Because I know many other cultures, Judeo-Persian, etc.,
Yes.
was formed. So was there any
So
such
that's
as a
really,
Judeo-Chinese language?
that's really interesting. My sense is that they didn't. They spoke Chinese, they wrote Chinese, actually, and that's really fascinating. We know that in the 17th and 18th century, a lot of members of the Chinese Jewish community really joined the elite by taking the civil service, which is very important in the Chinese imperial culture. We even know of Jewish men in the 17th century who became the magistrate of justice, like the minister of justice under the Qing dynasty. So they wrote Chinese, they spoke Chinese, and they retained Hebrew for the purpose of communal service, religious services. So the Torah was in Hebrew, and they could read it until the 19th century, but that's kind of it. That is my understanding of how they kind of navigated the different languages. And the original language was Persian, right? They spoke Judeo-Persian, but that was lost over the centuries. So my sense is by the 15th, 16th century, that was no longer a language that they used in their daily life. Like Chinese had very much replaced it. Thank you. I hope it answers the question. So actually, yeah, sorry.
Did you want to, Alan, I can see has is unmuted now. I don't know, or Alan Warshaw, I should say.
I'm unmuted, right? I'm okay, right? You hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. This is a really nice presentation. When you said earlier that the early people who came through India or specifically to China were traders, and so that helps explain where the Jews came to. But did they come? Do we know enough that they came from people displaced after the Second Temple being destroyed, or even since they're from Persia? Even from the first temple? Do we know enough about the origins of these early traders?
Not really. The idea, especially in India, the notion that they came after the destruction of the Second Temple is part of the oral history, but it's not substantiated by sources that we have. Again, it's a plausible narrative, but we don't have the historic evidence to confirm that this is indeed what happened. But it is plausible.
It's stirred into the lost tribes stories that we learn about over time, right?
Exactly, where there's a lot of guessing about who came where and where they settled, et cetera, et cetera. And indeed, I think part of the interest on the part of Westerners for the Jewish communities, both of India and China, was tied to this interest in the story of the lost tribes. I think that's part of also what piqued the interest of those Westerners, especially the missionaries.
Thank you.
Okay, Alan, thank you for your question, because we actually are going back to Kaifeng, because that was my first example I want to show you of acculturation without assimilation. Okay, so here actually, and that actually deals nicely with the language. You can see a memorial book of the Kaifeng congregation listing people, the list of deceased people in the community, and it's in both Hebrew characters and Chinese characters. So you can see really this bilingualism in the source. Okay, so now the first set of source I wanted to show you are stelaes from I forget what late 15th century and early 16th century. So those stelaes still exist, and they're in the Kaifeng Museum in China. So if you ever have a chance to go to China, you can actually see them in the City Museum. And those were very large memorial stones which were set up to commemorate each major rebuilding of the synagogue. So I mentioned that the Yellow River is known for flooding. And so whenever the synagogue was destroyed and then rebuilt, the community would build those really large steles. And what is on this? So this is really fascinating. So on this, they really articulate the harmony, the synthesis between their Jewish culture, their Jewish identity, and Confucian ideals. Matt, you're a great reader, so I want to take a 20-second break to give you some reading to do.
Thanks, no worries. And hopefully the chat is working. It's all enabled on our end, but I can see that Zoom updated it from last time I used it, which maybe is just today. So maybe there's still glitches there, but I'll go ahead and read it now. Although there are some minor discrepancies between Confucian doctrine and our own, in their main focus of ideas and established practices, both are exclusively concerned with honoring the way of heaven, respecting ancestors, valuing the relations of ruler and subject, obedience to parents, harmony within families, correct ordering of social hierarchies, and good fellowship among friends. Nothing more than the 5 cardinal relations of mankind.
So this is really interesting, because this is really a full articulation of Confucian principles. They acknowledge that there might be some minor discrepancies between their culture and Confucianism, but what they're saying is like those 5 cardinal rules of Confucianism are ours. We share the same ideals, right? So very much embodying the influence of Confucianism. And you can also see the influence of the surrounding culture in the synagogue architecture. And this is evidence that we have from the following century, from the 17th century and early 18th century, when Jesuits first started coming into China. So, and it's really interesting because that's true of both Jews in China and both in India. A lot of the historical evidence that we have is actually the evidence that was collected by Christian missionaries. So here's an example of what I'm talking about. Actually, to give you a little bit of background on this. So the first Jesuit who came to China was this Italian missionary named Matteo Ricci. And Matteo Ricci went to Beijing. And in Beijing, he was introduced to someone who followed a monotheistic religion, who only believed in one God. So he assumed that it was a fellow Christian, and he was very excited because Ricci was the first Jesuit to come to China, so there weren't many Christians at the time. So he organized a meeting with this man, and surely into, as they started talking, he realized that this man didn't know who Jesus was. So he realized, okay, then he must not be a Christian. So, and conversely, the Jewish man, Aitian, assumed that Matteo Ricci was Jewish because he didn't know about Christians. But then he also realized that, oh no, he's not Jewish, right? So Matteo Ricci became so enthralled by the idea that there were Jews in Kaifeng that he made overtures to the Jewish community. And he actually visited them. He attended services, and he drew lots of notes. He drew the depiction of the synagogue. So that's what we have today that allows us to imagine what the synagogue was like. And he recorded a lot of their religious practices, which is an incredible source for a historian, of course. The other thing that Matteo Ricci did is that alongside other missionaries in the 17th and 18th century, he tried to have the community sell their Torah scrolls. And here that's a really important part of the story, which is that one of the reasons Christian missionaries were so interested in Jews is that they believed that the Torah, the original Torah, had mentioned Jesus, but that Jews had obscured mention of Jesus to deny his nature as a Messiah. So they believed that maybe the Kaifeng Jews had an original Torah that supposedly had the name of Jesus. And so that's why they were so committed to buying those Torah scrolls. So the community was quite observant and they did not sell their scrolls. However, by the 19th century, when the community very much declined and they were very poor, they did sell their 12 Torah scrolls. So now the Torah scrolls are one in London, I think, and probably the British Library, and then Canada and the US. So this is one example here of a Torah scroll that has been collected and is now in Los Angeles, I believed. So these are the Torah scrolls that the missionaries tried to buy in 17th century Kaifeng. So here's what another missionary, Jean Domingue, who was a French Jesuit priest, drew when he encountered the Kaifeng Jewish community. So on the left side, you can see what the synagogue complex looked like, right? So those three levels of courtyards. And what's really interesting, here you have a reconstruction, actually, a model based on those drawings. Let me go back to this photo. That the synagogue architecture is very much resembling that of a Confucian shrine, right? So you can see the influences of the local culture in the synagogue architecture itself. But that's not it. The influences were not limited to the synagogue architecture, and that's what we gather from those missionaries' accounts. So here on the left side, the synagogue, as I pointed, and to the right side, you can actually see those Kaifeng Jews reading from the Torah. Okay, so it's a Shabbat service, and they're reading the Haftarah, the Torah in a scroll that they put in what they call the chair of Moses. And in one of the accounts I saw, they said that actually the person who read from the Torah would cover their face in a thin veil, kind of to go back to the biblical mention of Moses covering his face. So this is a kind of a colored representation of the synagogue based on that 17th century representation of the synagogue. And I think it's nice with the color because it kind of gives you a sense of what it would have looked like at the time. And what's really also interesting is that it's quite a large space, right? It wasn't a small structure. It was a pretty large culture. It was hosting multiple rooms. And in one of those rooms, they actually worshipped ancestors. And so again, this is very central to Chinese culture, ancestor worship. And this is something that Kaifeng Jews very much adopted. So Matt, if you don't mind reading, this is an account from 1704 by another Jesuit missionary by the name of Jean-Paul Gozani.
They all answered, and even their ruler, that they honored him in like manner as the Heath Literai in China, and that they partook with them in the solemn ceremonies performed in the halls of their great men. They added also that in spring and autumn they paid their ancestors the honors which are usually offered up to them in China in the hall adjoining to the synagogue, that they indeed did not offer up swine's flesh, but that of other animals, and that in the common ceremonies they only presented china dishes filled with viands and sweetmeats, together with the incense, making very low bows and prostrations at the same time.
So here, this is really interesting, right? Because you have, again, this synthesis between Chinese culture and Jewish culture. So they're honoring ancestors, they're presenting meats as part of this ancestor worship. They're bowing, like other Chinese groups would do it. However, they don't use pork, right? They use kosher meat, right? So they're really adjusting those practices to their own specific religious distinctiveness, right? And there is further evidence of them adopting those Confucian practices. And one other example of this is the use of the incense bowls. And this is something that was recounted by the same Jesuit missionary. Matt, sorry, I'm putting you to work.
No worries. At our going out of the synagogue is a great hall, which I had the curiosity to look into. I saw nothing in it except a great number of incense bowls. They told me this was the place where they honored their holy men or great men of their law. The largest of these incense bowls, which is for the patriarch Abraham, stands in the middle of the hall, and after this stand those of Isaac, of Jacob, of his 12 children, called by them the 12 descents or tribes of Israel. Next are those of Moses, Aaron, Joshua, Ezra, and of several illustrious persons, both men and women.
So here it's the same phenomenon at play, right? Where they're adopting local tradition, but with a Jewish twist, right? The patriarchs are the Jewish patriarchs, so they keep those traditions alive. On the left side, you can actually see one of those incense bowls that was used in the synagogue. Again, as I said, a lot of the objects that were in the synagogue are now in North America because they were sold by Christian missionaries who brought them to America. So here you see this really interesting interplay between Confucian and Buddhist cultures and Jewish traditions. So we're not going to read this letter, but I will share it in my PowerPoint. This is a letter by another Jesuit priest who also mentioned that their Hebrew, so because they still read in Hebrew, right, as I said earlier, but that they pronounce it in a Chinese manner, right, and that it was very hard to understand because some sounds don't exist in Chinese, and so their Hebrew was kind of hard to understand to a Christian missionary who had learned Hebrew in Europe with a very distant linguistic base. Okay, another thing I forgot to mention, but that I find really interesting is that when it came to the synagogue architecture, the main gate of the synagogue was actually guarded by a pair of lions. And this is something like I live in Singapore. If you go to any temple, that is very common to the architecture of Chinese temples, right? And then one very important part of their identity, and it's obviously tied to Confucian culture, but also to the notion in Jewish culture of dina de machuta dina, you have to respect the law of the land. They had within the synagogues a lot of displays of loyalty towards the emperor. So over the Aron HaKodesh, the Ark of the Torah, you had a placard that had the Shema Israel, and right under it there was a statement pledging loyalty to the emperor, right? So those two things were very much central to how they saw themselves as loyal Chinese subjects, but also practicing Jew. And so what those missionaries recounted when they visited them in the 17th and 18th century is that they kept many of the Jewish traditions. They continued circumcising their children. They observed the major festivals, especially Shabbat. On Shabbat, they lit no fire. They didn't do any work. And among the festivals that they mentioned that were still in observance in the community were Pesach, Purim, and Tisha B'Av. They also prayed in the 17th century. They prayed 3 times a day with a minyan. They read the Torah portion. So clearly, they still had a pretty strong Jewish life. Okay, Matt, it's 9:01. So because that's the beauty of having the opportunity to discuss this topic over three sections, I think maybe we'll end here. And when I see you next week, we'll pick up the topic of acculturation with the Cochin Jews of the Malabar coast of India. Does that sound like a plan? So I'm happy to take questions, comments. If I don't have answers, then great. I can do some research and answer next time. Does that sound good to everyone? So I'm going to stop sharing.
Yeah, there's a few. So seems like some people have been able to access the chat and others haven't.
Yeah.
I'll start with a few questions that have come in the chat, and then if others can't, you can use that hand raise button on the screen. I think it's under the React button. Okay. There's a couple of questions about the Torahs, and so one was, were the Torahs still in Hebrew? And then I guess connected to it, somebody else asked if they were accurate with regard to the Masoretic texts and cantillation marks, and maybe just in 2 sentences say what the Masoretic texts are for those who may not know, and where were they made. If I want to just, I'll throw all 3 of those questions out there.
Okay, so I'm not really an expert on the text, but from what I've read is that there were some mistakes in the text. So both in terms of like the ways that the letter, like the actual text, the way that their letters were written. So my understanding is that they didn't have qualified scribes. So they relied on imported Torah scrolls. I don't know to what extent the 12 scroll. This is, again, actually the Torah scrolls, I'm not an expert on this, so I'll have to research this for next time. But out of the 12 scrolls that we still have, I'm not exactly sure, how old they are and if they're written in China itself. That's something I'm not sure about. So I will research that for next time.
Thanks, wonderful. And as a related question, somebody asked if there's any evidence that they had the Talmud and sort of rabbinic texts.
I have not seen that. So I don't believe that Talmudic study was part of their tradition.
Okay. And just one more quick question, and then I'll get to all the hands raised. Was there a hierarchy of holiness among the 3 parts of the synagogue complex, similar to the temple in Jerusalem?
That is a great question. And I'm not sure. Okay, thank you for this question. This is great. Okay, I will research this. That is a fascinating question, and I'm not exactly sure. That would make sense. It's plausible, but I cannot answer that for sure. So I will do a little bit of research for next time.
Okay, great. Thank you. And then, okay, I see Jenny here popped up first, so hopefully you'll see a screen come up. Okay.
Yeah, great.
Yep.
Thank you. No, I was just wondering, I have a distant cousin, Joseph Preuss, Preuss, who wrote what I understood was one of the original sort of booklets on the history of the Jews of Kaifeng. And I was just wondering if that's still a reference or a resource, or maybe that has fallen into disuse.
Their name sounds familiar, so I think it's very much part of. I mean, they've been actually a lot of sources of the Kaifeng Jews. There are hundreds of sources, which is interesting given the historically small size of the community. But while I'm not familiar with it, the name sounds very familiar. So I think I came across his writings when I was preparing.
He was a physician, and he migrated in the early 1900s. The original text is with the Israeli museum, but I'm fortunate I was able to locate the copy. So of course it's very special to me, even though I know
That's
that
fascinating.
has, certainly, gone on since when he wrote the text. Yeah.
So where did he move from, and where did he move to?
Germany.
From Germany to the US?
No, to Shanghai.
So he lived. He moved to Shanghai.
And wrote about the Kaifeng Jews, and
Fascinating.
He donated things that he had, I guess, acquired there to the museum upon his death, and they still have.
That is fascinating. And here, actually, allow me to mention that Shanghai is a place also with lots of Jewish history, a much more recent community. But Shanghai was a very important city for Baghdadi Jews. And it's also a place that is important for more recent history because it was a place of refuge for East European and Central European Jews in the 1930s and 40s. And there is a Jewish museum there. So that's definitely part of like Jewish history in China. I see Alan has a hand up. Thank you, Jenny.
Thank you.
Yes. The question I have is dealing with Hanukkah. Did the Kaifeng Jews or the Jews of India celebrate Hanukkah? Because I know, like the Jews of Ethiopia, they do not, because Hanukkah came after they moved or migrated to the land of Ethiopia? Because that could tell you probably when they moved.
That's fascinating. And actually, it is possible that they didn't celebrate Hanukkah. That's on top of my head. I don't remember it being one of the holidays that observers mention as being practiced in those communities. So to your point, yes, that would be an interesting way to potentially date it. Yes, interesting. Yeah. Thank you.
I see Ash has his hand up. You wanna...
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Geraldine, for covering the ancient history of Jews in India. I grew up in India, and there's a lot of respect for the Jewish community. Like in few seconds, I can mention something quickly. Dr. Mordecai Hafkin, he was a immunologist out of Ukraine. He migrated to what was then Bombay and established an institute in vaccinology. And he invented lots of vaccine, and those vaccines really helped the Indian population a lot. And then there were so many others, Jews, who contributed so much to India and its population, its history. By way of example, General Jack Raphael Jacob, he was the general in the Indian army who led the Indian forces to liberate Bangladesh. And he
Fascinating.
negotiated all the later on as to how things will be established in Bangladesh. 57 years ago, 400th anniversary of the synagogue in Cochin was celebrated, and Mrs. Indira Gandhi was the prime minister then. She participated in the celebrations, not for the votes, because the number of votes of the Jewish community is small. It was because of the contributions of the Jewish community to India. Then there was a character actor of the Indian movies, David. Everybody knew him as Uncle David. And in every prime minister's speech, the people in the public meeting wouldn't leave until Uncle David gave his last comments. And David was a character movie star in India, very popular, later on migrated to Toronto, where he had his relatives. His full name was David Strauss. So a lot of contributions by the
That's
Jewish
fascinating.
community. We call them Yehudi, and we had tremendous respect for them, and they contributed tons of stuff to India.
Ash,
Thank
may I
you.
ask where you grew up in India?
Hyderabad, which is in south central
Oh
part of
yeah.
India. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, thank you for mentioning all this. And just to echo this, yes, you mentioned a few contributions, but there are many more. And one of them that's a little known is that they also, Jews contributed to Bollywood as actors, producers. So I mentioned Shanghai as a place of refuge for European Jews. Another place of refuge was India. So there were a lot of German Jews, particularly, who moved to India, and some of them became involved in the movie industry. And then a lot of Indian Jews from India, especially Baghdadi Jews, became involved as actresses. And there's a beautiful documentary that you can find online, probably for a small fee, called I think Shalom Bollywood. I can share that with you, Matt, if people want the exact reference, which traces this history. And then to echo what Ash was saying, under the British, the Bnei Israel Jews of Bombay became very involved in the army, and some of them became really high ranking. And then after independence, there were also a lot of prominent Jews in the Indian military. So, and again, like this is because someone I see in the chat ask about why they left. So as I said, they didn't leave because of anti-Semitism, but they left for, I would say, two main reasons. The first one is those communities maintained a strong sense of having a homeland in, what was ancient Israel before the creation of the state of Israel. So I would say more religious reason or spiritual reasons. And the other one is that the 50s, late 1940, late 50s and beyond is really a process of decolonization, right? So the British leave, and there's a lot of political uncertainty about the political situation. And Jews under the British very much were part of the colonial structure in some ways. And so there was a lot of worry about what their fate would be in those new post-colonial states. And so most of the Baghdadi Jews, actually, who had been very involved within British colonial society, left to Australia, the US, Canada, some of them Israel. And Indian Jews with kind of origins tracing further back than Baghdadi Jews. Some of them also went to English-speaking countries, and others went to Israel. And actually, that is a very important topic that I will cover in our last session. I want to talk about what happened when these Jewish communities moved to Israel and the kind of ethnic divisions and the discriminations that they faced. But that will be at the very end of our lecture series.
Not only there is no anti-Semitism in India, there's a lot of love for the Jewish community in India. And a lot of Jews, they migrated to Israel because of the opportunities Israel was offering for their getting better quality of life.
Exactly. And the economy, I mean, people want, I think that's a reason some people move today also, not just because of their attachment to Israel, but also because they're seeking, better economic opportunities. I mean, there are all kinds of reasons why people move. But again, to go back to what you were saying, Ash, I think a lot of Indian Jews maintain very deep ties to India and go back there and visit their remaining relatives and promote Indian culture. Because I served with JDC in India, I'm still part of all kinds of Facebook groups. And I can tell you, I know a whole group of young Indian Jews who are, who have started like clubs of Bollywood dancing in Israel. And they're promoting Indian, not just Indian Jewish culture, but Indian culture. Like dancing, already when I was there 10 years ago, dancing was very important to the Bnei Israel community, and they knew all the Bollywood songs, and so they're bringing this to Israel. So in some ways, they're bringing a piece of India to Israel. And if you know where to look for it in Israel, you can see it. It's just that most people don't know about this heritage, but it's definitely very much present today. Thank you so much, Ash, for this.
There's a couple of comments in the chat. I don't see any other questions at the moment. Somebody just mentioned that there's a Avotenu DNA project which has tested
Interesting.
Jews, and they put a link in the chat, and
So what?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Maybe to give you a sense of what we'll cover next time, we'll talk more about this question of acculturation, and we'll talk about the Cochin Jews and the ways in which they adopted kind of a caste-like system within the community, in which there were very clear distinctions between the Malabari Jews who had come, say in the 1st century, and the more recent arrivals of Sephardic Jews from the 15th century and 16th century, and the kind of discrimination that the earlier immigrants to India faced. So you can really see the influence of Hindu caste culture. So they weren't caste, and I wouldn't compare them fully to caste, but I would call it a caste-like system. So we're going to look at how that played out in the Indian Jewish community, and we're going to talk about holidays that are very specific to the Jews of Cochin and the Bnei Israel. And then in the second half of the lecture next week, I'm going to finally introduce the Baghdadi community, which were more recent arrivals to India, and the tensions between the older Bnei Israel community and the Baghdadi Jews. Because I mentioned, defining the boundaries of Jewish life and Jewish identity. So this very much played out between those communities in the 19th century. And we're going to look at this through legal cases about building synagogue and who could participate in synagogue life. So we have a lot to cover. And so I will, for the questions that I have only partially answered, I will try to do a little bit more research. And, before next week, if anyone has further questions, further thing they would want clarification on, Matt, please do share my email and you can reach out to me. I have to say, this is the beauty of having more of a classroom feel. It's a bit more interactive. So I can also kind of respond to your needs and desires a little bit better than when we don't have that kind of format.
Wonderful.
Okay, I'm seeing a few more questions. Wait, Matt, let me go.
Did you?
Sassoon's Kadris, yes. Yes, not in great depth because we have a lot to cover, but we will talk a little bit about the Baghdadis in China, Southeast Asia. So there will be mention of those families.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much. I think this is a nice moment to end on, and I'm sure everybody's looking forward to next week. I know I am. So I appreciate it, and as probably most of us here are heading toward closer to bed, I hope you have a great day, and we look forward to next week. So take care, and thank you all out there for joining us.
Thank you. And I appreciate all of you joining me. This is a great way to start the day for me. So thank you all.